All right, so welcome back to another lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to be doing chapter 5 here, and this is going to be covering our bones and our skeletal system. Kind of in general, we'll look specifically at our axial skeleton, in contrast with what we'll call later our appendicular skeleton. And then we'll also look at some skeletal physiology as well. Okay, so let's see here. So to begin, there is oftentimes uh, some incorrect beliefs towards the skeletal system and what things are made of bone or what animals are made of bone or what parts of them are made of bone. So here you have two common examples. So here you have a spider and you have a canine, right? You have a dog. These are completely inaccurate skeletal features. Now, some of this information here on the dog is right, but here, if you notice the ears are not made of bone, the ears are made of cartilage of sorts. And then when you look at the spider here, spiders don't have bone at all. They have an exoskeleton. They don't have ribs like this. They don't have these metatarsal type digits here like humans do and mammals do. But instead, they have an exoskeleton made of something called chitin. Okay, chitin is the same thing that makes up the outer portion of fungi, okay, or fungi. So you also then have some helpful skeletal features, right? Some helpful skeletal anatomy. And so we have a couple of things here. So here on the left, we have an ancient hominid named Lucy. Lucy is dated somewhere around 3.2 million years old. She was an early hominid ancestor of other hominids, so other kind of bipedal, upright walking apes. You see some skeletal remnants here, so of some portions of the skull of some different hominids here. So Australopithecines, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis. So this is Neanderthals, and then Homo sapiens here. This is our species. And then this image up here, I put this on here. This is an image of a mosasaur vertebrae. Mosasaurs were um, ancient marine reptiles. They weren't dinosaurs, but they were similar to dinosaurs, but they were actually a big marine reptile, so they're kind of like a lizard. But you can actually find these vertebrae. You can find them in Texas. You can find them in the North Sulphur River, which is just kind of northeast of Dallas. You can find them tumbling in the river. Um, and so it's a really neat thing to experience. But all of these are ways in which the skeleton has proved useful for individuals and for education and for research over the years, right? So when we look at our bones, when we look at our skeletal system, we can divide it into a couple of parts, right? So we can divide it into the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Everything you see here on this image to the right, everything that you see here in white, this is all axial, so along the midline axis of the body. Everything you see off to the side is appendicular skeleton, so really associated with the limbs. All right. So in this lecture, we're going to look at first, we're going to look at kind of general bone anatomy, some bone physiology, different functions of bone. And then we'll look at the axial skeleton. So all of this that we see here highlighted in white. And then in the next lecture, we'll look at everything that you see highlighted here in blue. Okay, so starting off looking at our bones. So bone is a type of connective tissue. It is also known as osseous tissue. And this is the major tissue in our body that is providing support and providing structure to our body, right? So in order for us to maintain our upright bipedal nature, we have to have bones. Bones provide the skeleton around which the rest of our body is situated. We know that bones themselves don't produce movement, neither do muscles themselves, but it's the functioning of the muscles and the bones together that result in movement, right? In conjunction with the nervous supply from the nervous system. Now, inside our bones, we have something known as marrow, all right? And we have two types of marrow. We have red and we have yellow. Sometimes these are called red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. So in general, red bone marrow, we find at the ends of bones. We find it in a type of bone called spongy or trabecular or cancellous bone. And the red bone marrow is the site of hematopoiesis. So the term hemato means blood, and poiesis is referring to the synthesis of, or the production of. So hematopoiesis means the synthesis of blood, or the production of blood, specifically the production of blood cells. So white blood cells, red blood cells, and our platelets. Yellow bone marrow, on the other hand, is instead of being located in areas of spongy bone, which we'll talk more about spongy bone later, but is this all kind of all this porous region of bone here. This is all trabecular or spongy bone. Yellow bone marrow, instead of being there, it's located in the middle of bone in a region known as the medullary cavity. All right, and yellow bone marrow is almost entirely adipose tissue, so it's almost entirely fat. Right, and we'll see later kind of some things that can relate to yellow bone marrow and the adipose tissue and how it can relate in a more clinical setting. All right, so in order to get the cells that we're going to be using when we talk about our bones and whenever we talk about the red bone marrow, we have to get them from what's called a multipotent stem cell. All right, sometimes this is called a hemocytoblast. All right, so this multipotent stem cell here, sometimes referred to as a hemocytoblast, is a stem cell that can differentiate into any other type of blood cell. All right, so that means red blood cells, this means white blood cells, and it means platelets. So for us, here we can look at erythrocytes. So we have this erythroblast transforming into erythrocyte. We can have this megakaryoblast turn into a megakaryocyte. And the fragments of megakaryocytes are what we know as platelets or thrombocytes. And then all of these others are different types of white blood cells. So you have 5 types of white blood cells: neutrophils, lymphocytes, eosinophils, monocytes, and basophils. All right. So for this lecture and for this course, you don't have to know every single white blood cell. Um, just know that there are white blood cells and they all come from this common stem cell ultimately. In future lectures and in future courses, you'll learn the specific types of white blood cells, how to identify them based on their cytoplasm and granules and nuclei and whatnot, and what their general functions are. All right, but for now, know that all these blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, all come from the same multipotent stem cell, which we said is sometimes called a hemocytoblast. And this is happening in our red marrow, our red bone marrow. Okay. Now, along with the vascularization of bones, so we have red bone marrow that produce our blood cells. We also have blood vessels that enter into our bones to provide them with a blood supply. We also have nervous tissue, right? So if you've ever broken your bone, you know that it hurts, right? Well, the reason that it hurts is because you have nerves that are supplying that bone, right? So we have ones that are called nutrient arteries, which is this kind of one main artery that enters into the bone. You have ones called epiphyseal arteries that supply the epiphysis of bone, which is kind of toward the ends, and we'll talk about that later. But bone is a connective tissue and it is a living tissue. So it has to be able to undergo cellular respiration. It has to be able to receive oxygen, nutrients. It has to be able to have waste products taken away. So just like most other tissues in the body, bone is very vascular and it's going to require a blood supply. All right. Now, when we look at specific types of bones, we can classify them based on their general shape. All right. And we'll see this as we talk more about the appendicular and axial skeletons. So we have long, short, and flat. These are 3 different types, and we have some more, but we'll talk about these 3 first: long, short, and flat. Long bones are very descriptively named. They're longer than they are wide. All right. So you can think of lots of things like this, like a pen or a pencil. It is longer than it is wide. So the bones of your arm, they're longer than they are wide. All right. Now, for our, all right, sorry about that. So our long bones, as we said, they're longer than they are wide. Um, these are going to be things like our humerus, our radius, our ulna, the bones that you see in your forearm, the bones in your upper arm, the bones in your thigh, and the bones in your leg, so below the knee. These are all examples of long bones. Okay, they're longer than they are wide. So think of something like the femur, the humerus, radius, ulna, tibia, fibula. All of these are examples of long bones. Now, when a bone is roughly as long as it is wide, so it's equal in those, it's kind of cube shaped, you call it a short bone. These are the bones that make up our wrist and our ankle. So the carpals of the hand and the tarsals of the feet. So if we look here at the hand, you can see the carpals, and you'll learn the specific carpals when you do things in lab, and you'll learn the tarsals as well. But they're roughly kind of, I almost kind of like to think of them as pebble shaped. They're kind of small, kind of look like rocks. They're roughly equal in length and width. And then you have flat bones. Okay, flat bones are very thin, they're typically broad, and they can also be curved. So think of things like the skull. If you were to disarticulate the skull and take it apart, you have individual bones, and each individual bone is relatively thin, and very few of them are straight. If any of them, they have a curve to them. All right. Also, your sternum, so your breastbone, right? So this is a very flat bone that sits right at the anterior aspect of the body, and it helps to protect the underlying heart and whatnot. This is a very flat bone. All right. Now, we also have ones called sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bones are very small, kind of refers to like a sesame seed shape. And a sesamoid bone is specifically a bone that develops within a tendon. All right. So tendons connect muscles to bones. A sesamoid bone is found embedded within a tendon. And our best example of this is the patella. So kind of what we think of as our kneecap, right? So you can feel your patella very easily if you straighten your leg out, if you extend it all the way. You can. I'm sorry, if you kind of flex it a little bit, not extend it. If you flex it a little bit, you can see and you can feel this bone moving along relatively easily. Okay. You also have irregular bones. All right. So irregular bones are those that really don't fit into any of the other categories. They're not sesamoid, they didn't develop in a tendon, they're not long, they're not short, they're not flat, and so you just call them irregular, right? So some of the bones of the skull are like this, but the vertebrae are a very good example of this. So they have a very strange shape. Parts of them are round and some parts of them are flat and parts of them are pointed and some of them have holes in them and these openings. And so they have this very irregular shape. And so if you look at a vertebrae really doesn't look anything like any of our other bones, long, short, flat, or sesamoid. All right. All right. So now if we look specifically at a long bone, we look specifically at the long bone category, we see that it has a couple of different features. All right. So one of these features is called the periosteum. Okay. The periosteum, the term peri means around, and osteum refers to bone. So this means a layer that goes around the bone. If we look over here to the right, you see this tissue that is kind of being peeled up. This is an example of the periosteum. You also see these blood vessels coming in. These are called periosteal blood vessels. This is formed by dense irregular connective tissue, and it's just this coating that surrounds the bone. Now, really what this is essentially where the tendon of a muscle blends with the bone. So the tendon doesn't attach directly to the bone, it kind of attaches to the periosteum, and then the periosteum wraps around the bone. All right. So the periosteum is a continuation of the tendon of a muscle. You also have perforating fibers. Okay, so these perforating fibers are these fibers that you see here that anchor the periosteum down to the deeper layers of the bone by these collagen fibers here. Okay. Now, just deep to that, on the surface or on the bottom surface of the periosteum, you have what's called cortical bone, right? Cortical bone is sometimes referred to as a compact bone. This is below the periosteum, and this is very dense. Okay, it's very dense, it's very strong. It provides resistance to compression, twisting, stressors, and we'll see later that it's made up of something called the osteon, right? And the osteon is the structural unit of this compact bone, right? Now, opposite of compact bone, or kind of the other type of bone, is known as spongy bone. Now, spongy bone has a couple of names. It's called spongy bone, it's also called trabecular bone, and it's also called cancellous bone. All right. This is a very porous type of bone. So whenever we looked at the slide previously, we looked at the red bone marrow. The red bone marrow is situated within and between these openings that you find in spongy bone, right? So you find spongy bone in areas of flat bone, kind of in the middle. And so in a bone like this, you'd find it here in the middle. And then you also find it at the ends of long bones in a region known as the epiphyses. And we'll look at that in just a little bit, okay? All right, so there's the periosteum as we said. There's perforating fibers, there's the compact bone, and then there's the spongy bone right in the middle. All right. So if we look here at our long bone, we can see the trabeculae. So the trabeculae are these outer regions way out here that so in these regions called the epiphyses, that make up the ends of the bones. So trabeculae, being that it's spongy, being that it's not as porous, it has a couple of functions. One, it serves for the site of blood cell production with the red bone marrow being there, but also because it's not as dense, it also serves to decrease the weight of the bone itself. All right. Now, we said earlier that we had a periosteum that went around the bone. You also have a layer within called the endosteum, right? So this is lining the next region that we'll talk about called the medullary cavity. So the medullary cavity, the term medullary, the term medulla means within, and so the medullary cavity is a cavity or a space or an opening running the length of the shaft of long bones, right? So if you picture your radius on the thumb side of your forearm or the ulna on the pinky side or your humerus or your femur or whatnot, running right through the middle of that bone, you have an opening. You have this hollow space, and the space is known as the medullary cavity. Within that space, you have lots and lots of fat, lots of yellow bone marrow. Okay. And then entering into usually somewhere in the middle here, this long middle region of the bone is called the diaphysis. Somewhere in the middle of that, usually just one, there is what's called a nutrient artery and a nutrient vessel. This is the main vessel that enters the bone, and then it branches and divides as it goes up the bone, down the bone, and supplies the bone with oxygen if it's the artery, and then with blood and oxygen. Then if it's the vein, it drains blood out of the bone and then ultimately back to the heart. So here we can see some of those features. You have medullary cavity, endosteum, compact bone, and spongy bone. All right. Now, so if we look at some of these features of the bone, we see that we have a diaphysis and you have an epiphysis, right? So the diaphysis, this is the shaft. This is this long region of the bone. When you feel your forearm and you feel that bony structure, what you're feeling is the diaphysis of the bone, okay? It has an outer region of compact bone and a very little spongy bone, but the spongy bone is going to, if anything, it would be on the very inside of it, but the vast majority of it's going to be compact bone, right? Now, if we get to the epiphyses, the prefix epi means on top, and the epiphyses are situated on the tops, or really the ends of the bone. So you have an epiphysis way out here, you have an epiphysis way down here, all right? So here's one epiphysis, here's another epiphysis, and here is the diaphysis, all right? So the epiphyses, they're what are contain the spongy bone, the trabecular bone. They also are covered on their ends by a layer of articular cartilage. Okay, so what type of cartilage is this? So we named it articular cartilage, but what classification of cartilage is it? Is it hyaline cartilage? Is it fibrocartilage? Or is it elastic cartilage? So pause the lecture and try to answer it. The answer is it is hyaline cartilage. All right. The hyaline cartilage here is a remnant. It's a leftover from when our skeleton in utero, when we were developing, was all cartilage, right? So we retain a little bit of that on the ends of our bones here, okay? So you can see here that we have something known as an epiphyseal plate associated with the epiphysis, right? So now technically this epiphyseal plate, this is in a region known as the metaphysis, okay? So the diaphysis is here, this long shaft. The epiphyses are out at the ends, and the epiphyseal plate, or the epiphyseal line as we'll sometimes refer to it as, this is in a region known as the metaphysis, all right, which is between the end of the bone and the shaft of the bone. So in between the diaphysis and the epiphysis, all right? So you'll have to practice using these words, epiphysis, diaphysis, metaphysis, to kind of get familiar with their use, all right? So you can call this two different things, and depending on what you call it, you're really referring to something different, okay? So when you call it an epiphyseal plate, this is also known as a growth plate. This is when the bone is actively growing in length, okay, or when the bone has the ability to grow in length. So during childhood, during adolescence, all right. In that case, the epiphyseal plate, it's made up of cartilage, okay. So it's made of cartilage in utero as we're a child and as we're an adolescent. As we mature, as we grow, as our bones get longer, ultimately all of the cartilage that makes up this epiphyseal plate or this growth plate, it gets replaced by bone. When it is all replaced by bone, as you see here, so these regions here are all bone, and this region here is bone, you change the name from epiphyseal plate to epiphyseal line. All right. And this is occurring in a process known as ossification. So we're replacing cartilage with bone. All right. So if we look here, what is, hopefully you didn't just see the answer that I just showed you. Which image here, left or right, which one is an adult, which one is a child? And then based on that, which has an epiphyseal plate and which has an epiphyseal line. All right. So pause the video, think about it, and I will go on and I will explain it. All right. So the one on the left here, this is the adult. All right. Because this is the adult, this has the epiphyseal line. Okay. This is sometimes called the epiphyseal scar. It's the leftover remnant of the cartilage that you had when you were a child, right? So that means the one on the right here is the child with the epiphyseal plate. So you can see here's the uh, diaphysis of a bone, here's the epiphysis of a bone. This is specifically the femur. And then here you see in the middle, it looks like empty space, okay? This is because this is made up of cartilage, and cartilage does not show up very well on a radiograph, on an x-ray. It appears as kind of really as nothing. So it appears as this black color. All right. So this space, this is not a fracture. It can sometimes be mistaken for a fracture in children. So you see it here in the femur, you see it down here in the tibia, and way over here in the fibula. This is the epiphyseal plate or the growth plate. So that means if you see this on an x-ray, you knew that this bone or this image was taken from an individual whose bones had not yet fused, had not yet closed, and were continuing to grow in length. All right. If you look at the one on the left, you see this kind of dark white line here, this dark white scar. This is the epiphyseal line or epiphyseal scar. That's the leftover of the epiphyseal plate from childhood. Okay. So if you looked at this image, this person's bones would not be growing any further because there's no cartilage. And as we'll see later in this process called interstitial growth, that is the bones getting longer, you have to have cartilage if your bones are going to grow. You have to have the replacement of cartilage with bone. And so if you have no cartilage, you have no way for the bones to grow. All right. All right. Now, you also have in your short, flat, and irregular bones, they're not going to have those same regions. So we talked about the diaphysis and the epiphysis and the metaphysis and the growth plate and all this stuff. In short, flat, and irregular bones, you have something different, all right? So you still have compact bone and you still have spongy bone, but it's organized a little bit differently, all right? So in these, you have an outer layer of compact bone, you have an inner layer of compact bone, and we have this inner layer, so this outer layer of compact bone, inner layer of compact bone, and this middle layer of spongy bone, okay, or the trabecular bone. And so if you look at this blown up image, you can see that's a trabecular bone. Trabecular kind of refers to all these little spicules of bone, these little spikes, these little branches of bone. And this is what you see all in the middle of flat bones, okay? And in this case, this is known as diploi. All right, so this diploi is this kind of intermediately located, this in-between region of spongy bone, in between two layers of compact bone, all right? Now, some of the bones that have this have additional large spaces within them called sinuses, right? And so this is, if you've ever had a sinus infection, it's an infection of one of these sinuses. And so you can see these on this radiograph. You see this one here kind of outlined by my cursor. This is called the sphenoidal sinus. You see this one here, this is called the frontal sinus. And then this one right here, this large one, this is called the maxillary sinus. These help with the resonance of our voice, and they also help with decreasing the weight of the bones in the skull to decrease the weight to make our bones a little bit lighter. All right. So we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up with the next part talking about some various surface features of different bones, and then we'll get into more of some skeletal physiology.